Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, beautiful-minded, intellectual freak. And today we're doing something a little different, all right? We're gonna be going over 3 different serial killers, 3 serial killers who have never been caught, which is terrifying to think about. But I always think these are very interesting. We're also going to be going over all the murders and all the suspects and all the little conspiracies involved and all of them. So unbuckle your seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and let's bust through this windshield into these unsolved cases together. First off, we're gonna start with the Cleveland torso murderer. Cleveland was a growing city before the Great Depression. Being on the Great Lakes allowed for economic growth, and the city really began to prosper. However, there were still dark spots within the city. One of those was Kingsbury Run, which was along the Cuyahoga River to about East 90th Street. And many people who were affected by the Great Depression often were forced to move there. It was filled with large homeless encampments, railroad hoppers, and lots of trash, dude. If you had trash, it was here. It was also right next to an area known as the Roaring Third, which was filled with brothels, gambling dens, cheap hotels, and rooming houses, and also bars, further adding to the depravity of the area. And this would be the location where all the murders took place. And it would all take place September 1934, when a woman's remains were found by a young man on the shore of Lake Erie. She was just a torso with legs amputated at the knee. Other parts of her body were found in later searches. However, her head was never found, giving her the name the Lady of the Lake. Coroner A.G. Pierce also noticed some kind of preservative had been applied to her skin, making it red, kind of like leather. But at this point, no one knew what was to come, and the official case for the murderer had not open yet. So this murder specifically wouldn't even be included in the official victim count until 2 years later, which brings us to a year after, in September 1935. 2 more bodies would be discovered in, don't laugh, Jackass Hill. Who named this? Just a street down from Kingsbury Run. One was identified as 28-year-old Edward Andrassy because of his fingerprints. The other was a 40-year-old white male who was never identified. And Andrassy's body would be found completely naked except for a pair of socks. And get this, he was drained of all of his blood and had rope burns on his wrists. He was also emasculated, if you know what I'm saying. So just like the most diabolical, like for what purpose? It just, all of these murders are so gruesome and intricate. It's extremely strange. The other victim was also emasculated and had the same preservatives as the Lady of the Lake. There are some crime scene photos of these bodies. I'm not going to show them, I'll just describe them. We have the full body, naked body of man with the socks on, with no head. My brain doesn't even let me think that this is real. It is horrific. I'm not gonna show that obviously on YouTube. And then there is also a photo of the missing head of one of the victims. Unbelievably horrific. I can't even imagine dying like that. My heart goes out to the victims, obviously, always, and also whoever killed them. You're a piece of shit and I hope you burn in hell. Okay, let's get back to it. Only a few months later, in January of 1936, a woman would discover the body of Flo Polillo. I love that name. A barmaid who worked in the Roaring Third. Her body would be wrapped up in newspapers and put in 2 half-bushel baskets and dumped next to the Hart Manufacturing building. She was killed by decapitation just like the other victims. But a unique thing about this murder specifically is that the murderer waited to dissect the body until after rigor mortis had set in. There is also a crime scene photo that I'm not going to show of the body. It's very hard to even make out to begin with. I don't really want to make it out, to be honest. So, it's just terrible. Wouldn't recommend looking any of these up. And later in that year, in June 1936, 2 young boys had discovered the head of a white male inside of a pair of trousers in Kingsbury Run. I can't imagine finding that shit as a kid. Like, as a kid, you kind of always want to come across something crazy. It's not like I was looking for bodies as a kid, but you'd see a ditch or something and be like, I bet there's a body in there. And if I found it, I could maybe be on the paper. But then you find it, and you're just like horrified for the rest of your life, and tormented with nightmares. So I feel really bad for these kids is what I'm trying to say. Within 24 hours, the decapitated white male was dumped on the Nickel Plate Railroad police building steps. And the victim was never identified despite having fingerprints and 6 tattoos. A plaster death mask was also displayed at the 1936 Great Lakes Exposition, and his official name would become the Tattoo Man. There would also be several other plaster masks that were made of the deceased just so they could get identified, and they would be made by taking photographs of the deceased person's face and then be made by plaster. So it's not actually the person's face, YouTube. It is just a plaster mask, okay? And when the Tattoo Man was found, his body would also be drained of all of its blood. And there is a autopsy report that is public. It's very interesting. Extremely hard to read because doctors, although go through years and years of schooling, don't learn how to write in any sort of legible way. So I can really only make out like a few words here. Like head severed at chin, clean, and straight, I don't know, multiple cuts, something, it's not, who wrote this? Anyway, if you want to try reading that, it's up on screen. You can pause it and try to read it. I'm gonna move on. And 1 month after this, a teen girl would find a full body of a 40-year-old male. Dead body, that is, I think that was implied. But there was also a large pile of bloody clothing next to the body, implying that the body remained where it was murdered. This body was also never identified. And the crime scene photo is also just, I can't even explain. It's just, it is a man. And in September of 1936, victim 6 was discovered after a man was trying to hop on a train and tripped over the upper half of a man's torso in Kingsbury Run again. And the police would find the rest of the torso and both legs in an open sewer pool nearby. The man was also never identified. And by this time, the murders were catching people's attention, obviously. And so when they were retrieving the body from the pool, there was over 600 people gathered to watch, which is gross, but also I understand. As people, we're just curious about these things, and if you're from a town where I'm from, where nothing ever happens, that's where you want to go, you know? I understand. It is highly believed that the murderer was in the crowd watching this all take place, because that is very common. Murderers love to come back to the disposal place and relive the experience, and even more so when people are around watching it take place. They take great pleasure in that sort of thing, so it is extremely highly likely that he was there. And the coroner would also note that the body was extremely clean and had extremely precise cuts as well, meaning that the murderer was strong and had good knowledge of the human anatomy. And this would be a picture of the shirt that was found next to the dead body by the pool sewer. And by this point, the city of Cleveland was really starting to feel the pressure. And the detectives on the case, Peter Marilow and Martin Zuliski, what the f are those names, worked tirelessly to interview as many people as they could. The former coroner Pierce would be replaced with Samuel Gerber, who had a law degree and vast medical knowledge, so he could work on the case with the detectives. Furthermore, a new safety director, Elliot Ness, was added to the case as well. And there would be 3 more murders in 1937. February 1937, a man would find an upper torso of a woman on the shore of Bretenal? What the? Look at this. This is the spelling. What is that? I don't know. And her lower torso would be found 3 months later, washed up on shore. But her case was unique because she was not killed by decapitation. Also, I just noticed that behind me is the Hereditary poster, and she's cutting her own head off. That's was not intentional. Also, great movie. Great movie. You should go watch this after we're done. But the victim was in her 20s and unfortunately never identified. In June 1937, a boy found a skull next to a burlap sack filled with skeletal remains of later unofficial identification of a 40-year-old woman named Rose Wallace underneath a bridge. And in July 1937, so only a month later, the National Guard was called to the Kingsbury Run area to control uneasy laborers, while their guardsmen spotted a body part in the Cuyahoga River in the wake of a boat. And the rest of the body would be recovered later, except for the head. But one thing to note is that the abdomen was emptied, and the heart was completely ripped out, showing the killer's aggression start to escalate a lot. fact. Not to mention that the murders are happening closer and closer together, which we see throughout most serial killers. They begin to escalate more and more, and the time frames and cooldown periods become shorter and shorter. But the final two confirmed victims would be in 1938. In April of 1938, a laborer found a woman's leg on the banks of the Cuyahoga River, and later police would find 2 burlap sacks with her torso and both of her legs in it as well. Coroner Gerber would also find drugs in her system, and this is the first victim that they would find drugs in, so it could have meant that they sedated the victim and then the murderer took advantage of them being under the influence, but it was never confirmed because her arms were never found and she was unidentified. And the last known murder would be in August 1938. A group of scrap collectors would be digging through the garbage and they would find not treasures, I'll tell you that. They would find a torso of a woman wrapped in a man's double-breasted blue blazer. That's very hard to say. And then wrapped again in an old quilt. And the arms and legs would be found nearby in a newly built box wrapped in butcher's paper and held together by rubber bands. This guy's just like having fun at this point. He's just like, what else can I do? I feel like he's just in his garage just grabbing for whatever and just being like, I'm gonna put this here and this there. I feel like this guy's just trying to do his best to evade police and evade any sort of pattern or like pattern that anybody could follow and not finding him. Clearly he was successful because we're talking about serial killers that haven't been found, but I was just like, how the f do you come up with that? And the victim's head would be found in a very similar fashion. And continuing to look through the dump more to potentially find more body parts, the police would find a second body only a few yards from the first. And the bodies would be conveniently placed within the view of Elliot Ness's office window. And that is what brings us to the suspects, conspiracies, and updates on the case. So let's look at suspect number 1. In July of 1939, a 52-year-old bricklayer, Frank Dolezal, was arrested for the murders of Flo Polillo, Edward Andressi, and Rose Wallace. He had actually lived with Polillo for a little bit, and he was well acquainted to both Wallace and Andressi, tying him to all the murders. However, investigators would notice that when he was in custody and questioned about the murders, a lot of his confessions knew niche details, but he was also rambling about nonsense all of the time, and some investigators believed he was heavily coached. And in a crazy turn of events, a few days before he was supposed to go on trial, Frank was found hung dead in his cell. And it is believed that he was murdered in his cell because he was hung from a hook that was 5 foot 7 inches from the floor, and Dolezal was 5 foot 8 inches, meaning it would be near impossible to hang yourself because naturally the body will pick itself up once it's under distress, I don't know. Either way, he got murdered. Additionally, it was found in his autopsy that he had 6 broken ribs to boot. So the strange circumstances surrounding Frank in his confession and his murder pointed him to taking the fall as the real killer. But there's also another suspect. Suspect number 2. Dr. X, aka Francis E. Sweeney. I prefer Dr. X. Sweeney was an accredited and, can you guess it, a somewhat troubled surgeon who lived, get this, next to Kingsbury Run. He also had access to multiple medical facilities in the area that would allow him to dissect his victims without question. Red flag, red flag. Francis would be interrogated extensively by Elliot Ness and other investigators on the case, but he would never confess anything. You piece of shit. I mean, unless he didn't do it, but it's really sounding like he probably did it. And he was also never directly linked to any evidence from the cases either. But it is generally believed that Sweeney was, in fact, the Cleveland torso murderer, because once he admitted himself to a sanatorium, the murder stopped altogether. Pretty suspicious if you ask me. But that concludes our first unsolved serial killer murder streak. So let's move on to the alphabet murderer. And no, it is not even close to as fun as it sounds. And by fun, I just mean alphabet. I don't know why that sounds. It just reminds me of Sesame Street. There are no Muppets or fun learning activities involved in this case. This next story would begin in Rochester, New York in 1971. And I'll just go ahead and tell you the reason why these are called the alphabet murders is that the victims, unfortunately them being kids, were murdered around the ages of 10 and 11, but all 3 victims' names weirdly had the same first letter in their surname, same first letter in their first name. So if you were Molly Mulligans, you were murdered, basically. And all the bodies would be found in towns with the corresponding initial, adding adding an even more horrifying element to their disappearances. So if you're Molly Mulligans from Montreal, you were double murdered. But any weird jokes aside, that's how I cope with these. I can't like read through these without trying to have some sort of light, otherwise it's just too dark for me, dude. But trigger warning, all these murders do involve children, so I just want to let you know that, but let's get into it. So the first murder began November 16th, 1971. A 10-year-old girl named Carmen Colon disappeared on her way back from running an errand for her grandmother. According to witnesses, Carmen would be going into a pharmacy to pick up a prescription for her grandmother. However, the prescription wasn't done yet, so the doctor said that she could come back later. And the store owner would hear her say, I gotta go, where she then headed to the parking lot and entered a parked car. She was then reported missing a few hours later. And then she would be witnessed by a group of motorists on the highway down Interstate 490, running down the interstate with no pants on and a shirt on, and it seemed as though she was running from a vehicle that was going in reverse towards her. And what makes this story so awful and sickening and it just makes me sick to my stomach is that none of the motorists stopped to see if the girl needed help. They only witnessed it, but they never actually got out and did anything about it. And the police were also never called. A witness would state that Carmen was being submissively led back to the vehicle, probably by her abductor. And 2 days later, she was spotted not far from the same interstate, 12 miles from her last sighting. However, this sighting would be much, much more dark. Her body would be found in a small ravine on November 18th. Her clothes would be found 300 feet from her corpse, and her pants were found days later. On November 30th, near where multiple motorists spotted her that first day. An autopsy would reveal that she had a fracture to her skull and vertebrae before being strangled. She would also be covered in fingernail scratches. And this would spark outrage in the papers and public. Not a single onlooker offered to give her help, causing her to meet her untimely death. If somebody got out of their car and helped, she probably wouldn't be dead. And because of the outrage, multiple newspapers offered a reward of $2,500 for any information leading towards the suspect. And local businesses would fuel the reward until it reached $6,000, which at the time was a lot of money. But even with the rewards and several suspects and investigations, there was no official suspect and they were cleared. But billboards would pop up with the text, "Do you know who killed Carmen Cullen?" The billboards would be 30 by 12 feet with her face on it asking for any information that could be given, but unfortunately there were no new leads. But talk about a town coming together. I love to hear that. It's like so unfortunate that nothing came of it, but it's just so heartbreaking. So the next victim wouldn't happen until about a year and a half later in August of 1973, and it would be Wanda Walkowicz. Wanda Walkowicz was born August 10th, 1961 in Rochester, New York. She lived with her mother, Joyce Walkowicz, and her siblings in a modest neighborhood on Avenue D, and she was described as a bright, friendly, and responsible child. She was so cute, and she would also be known for her very, very helpful nature. So on April 2nd, 1973, a Monday, Wanda would be last seen leaving a grocery store on Conkey Avenue, where she had gone to pick up groceries for her family. This is such a different time, dude. She's a child. Like, the fact that people had their kids just going out to get groceries, like, of course they didn't come back, dude. Of course, like, it's just the irresponsible. It's a different time. It was a different time, okay? If I ever have a kid, dude, strapped to my hip. Strapped to my hip. Mom is crazy. I've watched too much shit. All right, I've done too much research. All right, please don't let your kids go get groceries on their own. It's very irresponsible. But I understand it was a different time, and I'm not putting any blame on the family. That's horrific. Anyway, let's get back to it. She was dressed in a green coat, black shoes, and carrying a white bag. She would begin her walk back home, but she would never complete it, and she would never return. Wanda's disappearance immediately alarmed her family and the community, and a massive search was launched, involving law enforcement, community members, and volunteers. 50 detectives in total contributed to the search for Wanda. But tragically, the search would end the following day when Wanda's body was discovered by a motorist in a gully off State Route 104, approximately 7 miles from when she was last seen. And the autopsy would reveal that Wanda was found with additional signs of physical trauma, indicating a violent and very, very brutal attack. But there were a couple notable differences between Carmen and Wanda's death. One is that Wanda was found fully dressed, like she had been reclothed after the murder, which isn't that uncommon, especially when murderers feel remorse after they've done something. It is more common in children as well, through my research at least. And another would be, while Carmen was strangled by hand, Wanda would have marks on her indicating that she was strangled with something else, probably a belt or something shaped like a belt. I feel like the murderer is evolving in this way because there's a large cool down period. His first murder was a little bit more sloppy, whereas this one seems like it was a little bit more planned out. And the Saturday before her murder, however, Wanda was joined by a younger girl, and she said that they had been followed by a stranger as they walked along the train tracks that ran parallel to Conkey Avenue, the same road that was home to the supermarket Wanda had visited before her disappearance. Neither girl had gotten a good look at the man, as he had been hiding in a bush when they spotted him. Creepy. So this was reported, but he was obviously never found. And the investigation into Wanda's murder was extensive and exhaustive. The Rochester Police Department, along with the New York State Police and the Monroe County Sheriff's Office, conducted extensive interviews and followed up numerous leads. But despite their concerted efforts, the investigation grew quickly cold with no significant breakthroughs or suspects. And one of the major challenges faced by the investigators was the lack of advanced forensic technology available at the time. So despite the best efforts of the law enforcement, which I think there was a lot of effort for once from law enforcement, the case remained unsolved. But as technology advances, they are still looking into Wanda's murder, especially with breakthroughs in forensic technologies, making it easier for modern law enforcement to link DNA. Evidence collected at the crime scene has been re-examined using modern techniques and technology. So New York State Police continue to pursue leads, even as recent as April 2023, which is awesome. And the murder of Wanda, along with the murder of Carmen in 1971, seemed to be pointing to a potential serial killer in the Rochester area, targeting young girls with alternative names, and it would be a killer that would strike, unfortunately, again. And the next victim would pop up several months later on November 26, 1973. An 11-year-old girl named Michelle Menza, who was reported missing after she failed to return from school. Eyewitnesses accounts from her classmates said that they had seen her walking alone around 3:20 p.m., so after school, traveling to a nearby shopping plaza that was near the school. The intention of the visit was to grab her mother Caroline's purse that she had supposedly left inside one of the stores. Never send your kids to run errands alone in public places! PSA from Auntie Chris. Thank you. Okay, anyway. And a few minutes later, witnesses would observe Michelle sitting in the passenger seat of a beige/tan vehicle that was traveling at high speeds, with her inside crying. And later that same day, at around 5:30 p.m., a motorist observed a man standing by a car with the same description, tan beige car with a flat tire, parked alongside Route 350 in the town of Walworth. He was seen holding a young girl by the wrist. When the motorist had stopped and asked if they needed assistance, at least this guy stops, the man would quickly grab her wrist even harder and push her behind his back, standing in front of the license plate so the motorist couldn't see it. All red flags extremely all around to the motorist, and he would give the motorist a strong, menacing look, which would compel the passerby to drive away. What the f is wrong with— clearly this isn't his child. Anyway, and this would unfortunately be the last time any passerby saw Michelle Menza again alive, until a fully clothed body was found nearby in a ditch on November 28th at around 10:30 a.m. She would be found lying face down in the ditch alongside a rural road in Macedon, about 15 miles away from Rochester. And autopsy reports would show disturbing revelations, to say the least, including extensive blunt trauma to her body, strangle marks around her neck, and signs of— but weirdly enough, there were white strands of white cat fur discovered on her clothing, and a palm print was partially discovered on her neck. And analyzing her stomach contents, there would be contents of hamburger and onions, eaten only an hour before her disappearance and death, alluding to the fact that she might have been fed by the murderer before he actually murdered her. But this would allow detectives to match a partial description of eyewitness accounts of a man with dark hair, pale skin, and aged 25 to 35, standing approximately 6 feet tall and weighing about 165 pounds. And this was the description given by the eyewitness who claimed to have seen the young girl in the company of a middle-aged man at a fast food restaurant in the town of Penfield. And that is what brings us to our suspects, conspiracy, and updates. So our first suspect would be Miguel Colon. Miguel Colon was Carmen Colon's uncle, our first victim, and was considered to be one of the strongest suspects in the murder of Carmen, especially with the relationship he had with her mother, Guillermina. After the separation of her parents, he became very close with her. Weeks before the murder of Carmen, her uncle had purchased a car that closely matched the vehicle eyewitnesses saw pursuing the child on Interstate 490. And when the investigators finally investigated the car, they noticed the car had been cleaned thoroughly. Suspicious, and even had a strong chemical smell from the powerful cleaning solutions. And the dealership said they had not cleaned the car with the solution prior to the sale, since Miguel had purchased a car extremely recently. Another piece of evidence involved was a doll that belonged to Carmen. However, Carmen's relatives stated that she would travel around with him a lot, and may have just left the doll in his car at the time. But something was weird with Miguel, according to his friend. 2 days after the death of his own niece, he told his friend he intended to leave the country, stating that he had done something wrong in Rochester. What the f was that, Miguel? He would go from Rochester to Puerto Rico 4 days after the murder of his niece. When investigators did finally travel to San Juan to question him on March 1972, the local newspapers would unfortunately give him away, causing Miguel to flee from authorities. However, he later surrendered on March 26th, where he was extradited back to Rochester for questioning. His alibis after being taken into custody and his movements on the date of his niece's death were not credible. Shocking. And no one would corroborate these claims. However, despite the strong circumstantial evidence, there was no physical evidence to tie him to the case. However, Miguel would commit slewer slide in 1991 at the age of 44 due to an incident of domestic violence where he shot and wounded his wife and brother. So how he wasn't charged at all is a bit f***ed up to me. You know, but we still have another suspect, and that is Dennis Termini. He was another strong suspect in this case, and he was a 25-year-old firefighter. He was also a prolific serial offender, known as the Garage Grapist, cool name dude, who committed a minimum of 14 counts of grape against teenage girls and young women from 1971 to 1973. Remember those years? Yeah. Those years are important. He was also an owner of a car that matched similar descriptions observed by eyewitnesses during the girls' disappearances. And he would also live nearby at an address on Bach Street, very close to the area where Michelle Menza disappeared. And in the weeks around the death of Michelle, on January 1st, 1974, Termini tried to abduct a teenage girl at gunpoint, quickly fleeing the scene when the teenage was uncompliant with his request and began screaming, as you should, always scream and fight, always scream and fight and cause a fuss, okay? Because you don't want to go to the second location. Okay, back to it. And immediately afterwards, he abducted another potential victim, but was pursued by police before shooting himself in the head. Anyway, a forensic examination of the vehicle revealed white cat fur, similar to that dealing with Michelle Menza's disappearance. However, in January of 2007, Termini's body was used for DNA sample to compare his semen samples recovered from Walkowitz, and the outcome of the test showed that Termini was not responsible for her murder, although no DNA from the other victims could be compared with Termini's DNA. So he was only technically off the hook for Menza's murder, with the other girls being impossible to test because there was no physical evidence for them to test. But we have one more suspect, and that is suspect number 3, Kenneth Bianchi. Bianchi? I don't really give a because he's a piece of shit. We're just gonna call him Kenneth. Also, who the is named Kenneth? This guy was a actual serial killer, okay? It was not a good time to be in Rochester, New York at this time, because there's all these guys just walking around committing crimes. And Kenneth was, don't you know it, an ice cream vendor in Rochester that was known to have been at these locations close to the first 2 murders. And between 1977 and 1978, he and his cousin Angelo Buono Jr., I don't know your name, you're also a piece of shit, so I don't give a shit what your name is, committed the hillside strangle murders of 10 young women between the ages of 12 and 28. So We already know they're pieces of shit, all right? However, he was known to have driven the same color car. What is with all these guys driving tan beige cars? Just like Ted Bundy drove a tan beigey bug. What is that? Oh, you know what? No, I know what it is. I figured it's like non-distinct. It's not very like flashy, so they're like less likely to get caught, but clearly not. All right. Also, I need to put my glasses on. My head hurts and I can't see. Okay? I'm just gonna look like Austin Powers right now. For the rest of the video. They would find his car during the time of the abduction site as well, yet he claims no involvement after he got caught for his other crimes. So it's just very, very strange. But we have even one more suspect. Suspect number 4, Joseph Nasso. Joseph Nasso was a 77-year-old man who was arrested in Reno, Nevada after the murders of 4 women between 1977 and 1994, all of which were women of the night. But what was weird about his victims is the fact that each victim's surname began with the same letter as their first name, the same as the alphabet murders. And he had supposedly lived in Rochester in the early 70s and regularly traveled between New York and California. However, despite being a person of interest in the alphabet murders, DNA testing did not match any samples from his semen samples. He would be brought to trial in 2013 of June 18th and was charged for the murders in Nevada, where he was convicted and sentenced to death. So I guess it was just a coincidence that he was doing the same thing as the alphabet murderer, but just in a different location. So why are the alphabet murders so strange? Stranger than what they already were, with the surname and first name of the first letters matching. The matching initials were also matching with the place where the body was found. For Carmen Cullen, CC, she was found in Churchville, New York. For Wanda Wolkowitz, WW, she was found in Webster, New York. And for Michelle Mainza, MM, she was found in Macedon, New York. So this disturbing fact made the case very confusing, and it was this notable characteristic that gave him the name the alphabet murderer. It could be a very strange coincidence, but I highly doubt it. It seems very intentional to me. But the story, unfortunately, as we know, does not have a happy ending. No one has been charged for these murders. So that concludes our second unsolved serial killer case. And now on to the last, and probably least, because none of these are good necessarily. It's just this is the last one, all right? It is the I-70 strangler. For those of you who don't know, the I-70 strangler is an unidentified serial killer who killed all 12 plus of his victims within the states of Indiana and Ohio. His killing spree would last from June 1980 and end in October 1991. And the reason he was given the name the I-70 killer is because all of his victims were dumped along Interstate 70. The victims would be all adolescent young boys he met at gay bars within a 4-block radius of Indianapolis. The bodies would be either fully naked or partially clothed and dumped in rivers and ditches along I-70. But strangely enough, there was also another unidentified serial killer called the I-70 killer, where he killed 6 store clerks along I-70 from 1992 until possibly 2001. I guess the moral of the story is don't drive on I-70. I'm not gonna. You won't catch me on I-70, dude. What the f? So let's get into the murders. The first victim would be a 15-year-old man of the night, Michael Petrie. Petrie was known to work around the gay bars in Indianapolis. However, on June 7th, 1980, he would be reported missing. After his disappearance, he would be spotted riding around with a stranger in a car. And it would be just 9 days later when his body would be discovered naked in rural Hamilton County, Indiana. He would die from strangulation, and there would be no traces of alcohol or drugs in his system. And the next victim would come 2 years later in July of 1982, being found topless in a creek in rural Hamilton County as well, specifically near Atlanta, Indiana. And his name would be Maurice Taylor, a 23-year-old man of the night who lived in a boiler room in an apartment complex in Indianapolis. And his cause of death wasn't clear, but the coroner did believe it was due to strangulation. His corpse would also remain unidentified for 8 months because his mother was in a mental hospital and couldn't file a missing persons report. The third victim would be Delvoyd Lee Baker, a 14-year-old boy found semi-nude in a river in Hamilton County. During the police investigation, it was revealed that Baker was seen riding to the Indianapolis city center and that he called home around 10:30 to let his parents know he would come home late because he was out to watch a movie. What was weird is that his parents believed that he had no cash on him when he left. However, it was later revealed by a friend that him and Baker would go to gay bars for the last 3 months and sell themselves out for $20 to $25 a night. So it correlates with all the other murders that have happened as well as being a man of the night. Clearly this was this murderer's MO, because they're kind of easier victims because they're so easy to access. Furthermore, on October 2nd, Baker was seen crawling in a blue van driven by a white male. The next victim would be Michael Andrew Riley, a 22-year-old who disappeared on May 28th, 1983, and he would be the official fourth victim. He would be seen visiting the Vogue Theater, a nightclub in Indianapolis, and left with a stranger. Riley's body would be found nude on June 5th in a ditch in Hancock County, Indiana, near Greenfield, Indiana. His cause of death was strangulation with a towel. And the fifth victim would be Eric Allen Rotker, a 17-year-old male who disappeared on May 7th, 1985, and was found a few days later in a stream shirtless in Preble County, Ohio. His cause of death was also strangulation, but unlike the other victims, he had burn marks on his shoulder. On the day of his disappearance, he was seen at a bus stop and instead got in a car with a stranger.
Don't hitchhike, please. Don't hitchhike.
During the investigation, it was discovered that he was supposed to go to multiple job interviews the day he disappeared. However, he attended none of them. And one thing to note is that his friends and family denied that he was gay, but it was found that many of his friends were drug addicts and drug traffickers, which I guess alludes to the fact that he hung out with like a bad crowd. Not that gay people are a bad crowd, or maybe they were considered a bad crowd around those days, but he was probably gay and just not out, especially given that it's the same MO as all the other victims. But I digress. And then in August of 1986, the body of 29-year-old Michael Allen Glenn was found in his underwear in a ditch near Eaton, Ohio, and his cause of death was also strangulation. He was a handyman that lived in the outer limits of Indianapolis in a trailer, and he would remain unidentified for 3 years and was only identified through fingerprints. And 1 year later, on October 5th, 1987, at 10 p.m., James Robbins would go missing after leaving his mother's home, walking to the southern part of Indianapolis, and his body would be found 2 days later, completely naked in a ditch in rural Shelby County, Indiana. He was also strangled to death. And during the investigation, 2 witnesses would give conflicting information. One say they saw a Chevrolet Blazer, and the other one said they saw a red Jeep Wrangler Renegade near the crime scene. Jean Paul Talbot was found in a stream in Defiance County, Ohio in August of 1989. He was also strangled to death, and the next victim would be found only a few months later in August of 1989, Stephen L. Elliott, a man of the night, who was found only in his underwear in rural Preble County, Ohio as well, near I-70. His cause of death was strangulation. Clay Russell Boatman, age 32, was a licensed practical nurse. He would be found in a ditch near Eaton, Ohio by a group of children in August of 1990. His cause of death would be strangulation as well. And the next victim would appear within the same month now, so now it's just escalating more and more, getting those quicker cool down periods. The body of 19-year-old Thomas Clevenger Jr. was found semi-nude along a railroad track near Greenville, Ohio. But one thing to note is that Thomas had a learning disability, meaning he could hardly read or write. He grew up also in a very poor neighborhood and began drinking and committing crimes like stabbing his school deputy's headmaster at the age of 14. He had also began man of the nighting himself near gay bars to make money shortly before his disappearance. So again, just same pattern. And the 12th victim and final victim that we know of was found in a ditch on a gravel road in rural Henry County, Indiana on October 7th, 1991. Otto Gary Becker, and he was age 42, and he would be seen in a vehicle with 2 other men and being held down by them, driving down a major road, which was I-70. So now that we're done with all of those murders, horrific, let's get into the suspects, conspiracies, and updates. By 1983, shortly after the death of Michael Andrew Riley, the investigation team on the case would be 8 officers and the FBI. And according to their profile of the killer, he was believed to be an overweight 45-year-old male. It was believed that he was middle class and had a good job, more likely married, but slept in separate beds and had no intimacy with their wife. Obviously. He was probably attracted to little boys and to young men, and this led to the possible destruction of his career. I love how they get so detailed with these profiles. It just reminds me of Criminal Minds, and I love Criminal Minds. I like getting into the nitty-gritty of this psychology of all this. Anyway, and the shame and guilt he felt from his gross obsession led to him killing. And another murder would occur while all of the other murders were going on. The body of Daniel Scott McNeve would be discovered in a field near Indiana State Road 39 in Hendricks County. It was at the time believed that this death was potentially linked, but also committed by a different killer. The other killer was believed to be a white male at the ages ranging from 20 to 30. He more likely worked a low-skill labor job and outwardly extremely homophobic, but more likely a closeted homosexual who murdered because of his self-hatred and shame, which happens a lot of the case with serial killers. He was also very much in shape and had a hyper fixation of all things military. And McNeve's murder would be linked to Larry Eiler, a serial killer also known as the Interstate Killer, or Highway Killer, who murdered young men and teenage boys between 1982 and 1984, and died in prison in 1994 on death row due to AIDS complications. With there being numerous serial killers going on at the same time, it made it twice as hard for investigators to actually identify the I-70 strangler, which I don't really blame them. Clearly they were on the case, but there were so many people murdering everyone that they just couldn't whittle it down in the same area. Just don't drive on the I-70 highway, dude. I don't know what to tell you. But now that we have his description, let's look at the suspects in the case. Suspect number 1 would be Duncan Patterson, a 47-year-old man who in 1982 would be arrested in Indianapolis for statutory rape of young boys. He would be connected to the case because one of Delvoye's Baker's friends recognized him from when Baker was seen getting into his van. Patterson would also confirm this claim and say that he took Baker back to the hotel room and paid him $20 before dropping him off at the Indianapolis Central Library. And Patterson's claims would be backed up by eyewitness reports. And he would also pass the polygraph test. And he would be excluded as a suspect after his confession. You're still a piece of shit though. Okay, so suspect number 2 would be August Gus Cato, a resident of Carmel, Indiana, a town in Hamilton County where some of the victims' bodies were found. He was detained and interrogated, but no evidence was ever tied to him, and he was inevitably let go. So now we're on to suspect number 3, and that would be serial killer Larry Eiler. I don't know about you, but he looks like a piece of shit to me. He also looks like he could be anybody's PE teacher, and we discussed him earlier. However, after his arrest, investigators could not link him to the most of the killings, and instead would link him to numerous killings across numerous states, and some that might even be linked to him in Kentucky and Wisconsin. Suspect number 4 is believed to be the actual I-70 strangler, and his name would be Herb Baumeister. That sounds like a straight up villain name. Herb was an Indianapolis native born in 1947, and born to a semi-wealthy family as well. From a young age, he was not normal, all right? His friends would explain that he had a pee fetish and would like doing things like asking them what their pee tasted like, and he would often pee on his teachers' desks. He would also be often seen playing with dead animals, you know, as you do when you're a serial killer. So he's definitely got that serial killer stew boiling on the stove. And what's interesting is there's actually an interview where he took Polaroids of a dead raccoon that had been painted over, and this was before he was even a suspect on the case.
I said to my son, they're gonna hit that raccoon with a spray gun, and sure enough, they just striped right over its face and neck. Didn't even move it, no effort to, get it out of the way.
Why are you taking pictures of a dead raccoon on the... It's just very strange. I feel this interview is so eerie. And he would later be diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia as well as antisocial personality disorder, leading him to not being social in high school and not dating anyone. He would go on to Indiana University in 1965 and drop out after one semester, only to return in 67. He then would attend Butler University for a semester in 1972. Herb would then job hop around and eventually meet his wife. How the f did he find a wife? But he did. Juliana in 1971, and he would have 3 kids. But Juliana would report that they had only had sexual intercourse 6 times in their 25 years of marriage. I guess 3 times of which was successful. And she would never see him naked. And this matches the description given by police. Herb would also be admitted to a psychiatric hospital by his dad for 2 months. And when he got out, he founded the Save-A-Lot thrift store chain in Indianapolis in 1988. And this would allow him to move his family to Fox Hollow Farm, which was a very remote acreage. And this is important because when he moved to his new home, the I-70 would eventually stop. And his new home was crazy big lit, dude. It was 4 bedrooms, 10 baths, and 11,500 square feet with 18 acres of land, and he also had an indoor pool with multiple bars. This was the place to be, or not the place to be after what I explained. right now. This would essentially be his new evil lair. And at his new home, he would go on a insane, crazy killing streak. So far, 8 victims have been positively identified. However, as of January 2024, forensic teams are still working on the property and have found 10,000 human remains, meaning that he could be one of the most prolific serial killers to ever exist. Yeah, that guy that you just saw in that interview with the raccoon, that guy.
This was just, the painter should have had a chalk line drawn around his career.
And there are 3 identified males that have not been found. Hamilton County coroners implore people to please come forward if they have male family members that went missing in the 1980s to the 1990s. So here are those unidentified victims. John Lee Baer, age 20, went missing in Indianapolis in May of 1993. Jeffrey Allen Jones, age 31, went missing in Indianapolis in July of 1993. Richard Douglas Hamilton Jr., age 20, went missing in Indianapolis in July 1993. Alan Lee Livingston, age 27, went missing in Indianapolis in August of 1993. His remains were discovered in 1996 and later identified on October of 2003. Stephen Sperlin Hale, age 28, went missing in Indianapolis in April of 1994. Alan Wayne Brassard, age 28, went missing in Indianapolis in June of 1994. Roger Allen Goodlett, age 33, went missing in July of 1994. Before his disappearance, he was seen with Herb at multiple gay bars in Indianapolis. He was last seen leaving his mother's place where he lived. Michael Frederick Kern, age 45, went missing in March of 1995. He was last seen at a gay bar in downtown Indianapolis. Furthermore, his jacket was found at Fox Hollow Farm. Manuel Resendez, age 34, went missing in August of 1993. His remains were recovered in 1996, and he was fully identified in January 2024 from a family DNA sample provided in 2023. And Herb would be discovered by police when a man came forward in 1994 claiming that he was a regular at a gay bar and he would go by the name Brian Smart. Not so smart. And that this man had killed his friend Roger Goodlett because he had tried to kill him when he tried to strangle him using a pool hose at his mansion before he went missing.
They had an encounter in the swimming pool where the survivor was in the pool, and Mr. Baumeister came up behind him and placed a pool hose around his neck.
And it's important to note also, in 1994, Herb's son found a skull buried in their yard.
In 1994, she had observed possible human remains, including a skull and bones. Investigators say her husband claimed the skull had once belonged to his physician father, took the skull, and Mrs. Baumeister and her children never saw it again.
And when he asked his parents, Herb would say that his father, who was an anesthesiologist, had just given him a dissected skeleton and that Herb had just buried it in the yard. As far as I know, anesthesiologists don't really deal with skeletal remains. So good cover up though. And the man who came forward also claimed that in 1995, he saw Brian following his car and taking down his license plate number. And the police were eventually able to identify Herb as Brian Smart. Brian not so smart. Am I right? Okay, and would confront him at his mansion and ask to search his home.
According to police, all of the missing victims have several traits in common. Chief among them, alternative lifestyles, a dependence on drugs or alcohol, and arrests for male prostitution.
He and his wife refused, but in 1996, Julie divorced Herb. I keep calling him Herb. I think his name is Herb. I don't care. He's a asshole. Julie divorced Herb, I'm gonna keep calling him Herb, after he began to exhibit behavior that terrified her and her kids. She would then consent to a search of the property where 11 bodies were found.
County highway workers joined sheriff's deputies in the search for more bones. They helped investigators clear away some of the heavy brush that covers an area discovered last Friday that holds even more bones.
Herb would flee to Ontario, Canada, and end his sorry life with a .357 Magnum. He would also write a Slewer Slide letter where he said that he was sorry for taking his own life and making a mess in the Pinery Provincial Park, and chose this location because his first location had too many children. Yeah, no shit, it's a park. Okay. He also talked about how he felt bad about his marriage and his burdensome business. He would express no remorse for his killings and victims, though, because he's a narcissistic psychopath. Herb's home has actually been in numerous TV shows now and documentaries, including Ghost Adventures, and the evidence against Herb Baumeister is pretty damning, and it's pretty clear that he is the I-70 strangler, or at least somehow related. He was even tied to it in 1998 as well.
The FBI profiling came up with the conclusion that all of these people were killed by the same person. However, we had no information on who that person was, no leads or anything until last year Hamilton County discovered the bodies up on the Herb Baumeister farm.
So Herb is a disgusting monster of a human being who was finally stopped because of someone finally coming forward about his behavior in the gay scene in Indianapolis. But we do not know for sure if he is the I-70 strangler. Odds are good, but it is still technically an unsolved case. So in conclusion, I know that was a lot, but I hope you enjoyed the video or the information that I gave you. I hope you learned some lessons. You know, don't go hitchhiking, don't go on the I-70, don't let your kids go off on solo travels to get groceries. But truly, I just want everybody to stay safe out there. If you like the video, please like the video. Also, give me other topics to talk about down in the comments below. I really appreciate that you guys like this series. I love doing it. And until then, I will see you beautiful face in the next video. Okay? Bye.